Boldwood presents The Keeper, written by Diane Saxon, and read by Katie Sobey. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Friday the 26th of October, 15:45 hours. Felicity Morgan jammed her car into third gear and took the tight bend down the hill to Colebrookdale with fierce relish. It's not right. It's just not right. I'm 24 years old, for God's sake, and still being told what to do. She pounded the palm of her hand on the steering wheel and whipped around another curve. Not even told. She glanced in the mirror, her gaze clashing with Domino's. Nope, she didn't even have the decency to speak to me. She floored the accelerator and snapped out a feral grin as the car skimmed over the humps in the narrow road. She texted me. A freaking text. She shot Domino another quick glance and took her foot from the accelerator as the car flew under the disused railway bridge past the entrance to Ingenuity, one of the Ironbridge Gorge museums. Guilt nudged at her. I know, Domino. We've barely seen each other since I moved in because of her shifts and my workday. But for God's sake, a text? Really? She must have been so peed off to send me a text. It's her version of not talking to me. She's done it all our lives. Fliss blew out a disgusted snort. What the hell did you eat this time? Her bloody precious steak? One of her fluffy pink slippers? Ha! She appealed in the mirror to her silent companion. She said, "Don't forget to walk the dog." She pressed her foot on the brake and came to a halt, sliding the gears into neutral as the traffic lights halfway down the hill changed to red. They always did for her. Every bloody time. With a rebellious kick on the accelerator, Fliss revved the engine. She called you a dog, Domino. She couldn't even be bothered to write your name. She stared at the big, gorgeous, and demanding Dalmatian in her rear-view mirror. Her lips kicked up as a smile softened her voice. How could I possibly forget to walk you? An ancient Austin Allegro puttered through the narrow track towards her, just as the traffic lights turned to green on her side. Bloody typical. Domino raised his head to stare with aloof disdain at the passing Allegro, and Fliss sighed as the driver's wrinkled face, as ancient as the car, barely emerged above the steering wheel. There was only once, a few weeks ago, I forgot to walk you. You'd have thought Jenna would have understood. I was hungover from my break-up drinking bout. You, my darling, were suffering the consequences of a broken home. She let out a derisive snort as she put the car into first gear and glided through the lights, back in control of both her temper and her vehicle. Not that you ever really liked Ed. You were just being empathetic. You sensed my... She drew in a long breath through her nose. Devastation. You sympathized with me. How was I to know you'd eat your Auntie Jenna's kitchen cupboard doors off while I was sleeping? They still bore the deep, gouged teeth marks. We didn't have any choice but to move in with Jenna. We couldn't stay with him. He was too mean. He wanted me to get rid of you. Said it was him or you. She flopped her head back on the headrest. Ed, the perfect gentleman, tender, gentle, an absolute charmer. To the outside world. Insidious, controlling arse to her. It had taken so long to realize his subtle intention to separate her from her mother, her sister, eventually Domino. The slick maneuvers to keep her to himself. Unnoticed until her mother fell ill, when, in a flash, it all became clear. Poor Domino. She glanced in her mirror to share the sympathy between herself and her dog as she slowed down to pass the stunning Edwardian building she worked in on her right. Coalbrookdale and Ironbridge School dated back more than 200 years and had firmly entrenched roots at the centre of the Industrial Revolution. With the imposing cooling towers of the Ironbridge power station behind, they shared domination of the skyline from that angle. She blew out a breath, making her overlong honey-blonde fringe flutter away from her eyes, just for it to land back again in the same place as she pulled the car to a virtual standstill to take a closer look at the school. Closed for the day, except the few lights in the left side of the building still burning for the after-school club. A flutter of anxiety filled her chest. It hadn't helped that she'd had such a dreadful day at school. The kids had run her ragged as she held on to her sanity with barely a thread of control left. Who would have thought teaching would be so hard? Yes, she'd appreciated, before she started fresh from university a year gone September, that teachers worked long hours, but who knew children could be affected by the phase of the moon? Until Year 6 teacher, Sarah Layton, mentioned it to her at the end of their particularly fractious and demanding day. Why did they have to have a full bloody supermoon in term time? She cruised to the bottom of the hill. Perhaps she should have taken a leaf out of Sarah's book, gone home, poured a glass of wine, and sulked in front of the fire until she was obliged to mark homework. Instead, she'd been forced out of her own house by a text. Not that it was her house, and therein lay the problem. I love her to bits. I really do, Domino, but I'm not sure we can live together. 6 weeks is probably the limit. Fliss glanced in the mirror as she drew up to the mini roundabout, while Domino sat bolt upright in the boot, his proud head close to the rear window as he gazed out at the driver in the car behind. The woman smiled at him, just as everyone did when they caught sight of him, compelling them to give him the attention he was convinced he deserved. Attention Jenna never gave him, as she'd never forgiven him. Nor Fliss. The constant reminders wore thin. As her temper surged again, Fliss whipped the car around the pimple of the mini roundabout and then indicated left into the Dale End car park parents used when they dropped their children off at school. Despite her annoyance with her sister, she spared the school building another quick glance, the side view hindered by trees, but nonetheless stirring an affection in her. Steeped in history, it lent itself nicely to the quiet Victorian town. She loved it, with its small community and less than 200 pupils. Pupils who, on a normal day, were wonderful. They'd chosen not to be today. We need to find our own place, Domino. His ears twitched, and he cast an unconcerned glance over his shoulder at her use of his name. One closer to here, so I don't have to travel 20 minutes to get to work. It means I could spend more time with you. If we lived on our own, I'd need to get home earlier because Jenna wouldn't be there to see to you. She stopped the car in the middle of the car park to allow the elderly couple to cross over from the wrought iron gates leading to the Victorian tea rooms, and smiled at them, despite the mix of lingering annoyance and melancholy. I hate living on my own. It made her nervous, for no particular reason. It just wasn't right to live alone. She needed someone to protect her from her unreasonable fear of the dark and her own vivid imagination. Fliss's irritation cranked up again at the whine in her own voice as she circled her car around the almost empty car park and swung it with careless abandon into a space. She cut the engine and flicked the seatbelt undone. Before Ed, she'd never had such reservations. She was strong. She was capable. Her shoulders sagged. She hated to be alone. She shook off the self-pity, flung open the driver's door, and slammed it behind her before she strode to the back of the vehicle. She wasn't alone. Not entirely. She had Domino. He was company enough. Surely. "Wait," she commanded as she opened the boot. She sensed the dog's urgency, his desperate desire to run free, but he'd do as he was told. She had no doubt. She drew in a deep breath before she clipped the lead onto Domino's harness. She pressed her lips to his forehead as she fondled one silken floppy ear before she stepped back to allow him out. Bright and alert, all bunched muscles and restrained excitement, he bounded from the boot of the car and stood to attention, quivering in anticipation while she glanced at the people in the tree-lined park. She zipped her coat up to her chin against the chill wind and hunched her shoulders, determined to move and keep the cold out. "Which way shall we go, lad?" Muted voices floated across, an open invitation for her to join the others in Dale End Park. She chewed the inside of her lip, undecided for a moment, before she turned from the company of the twilight walkers with their idle chit-chat which she normally relished. They wouldn't miss her. Their unofficial dog meet was transient. If you turned up, you mingled. If you didn't, no one questioned it. A nice crowd, but she needed her privacy. "This way, Domino." If she allowed herself into their sympathetic fold, she'd be tempted to whine about Jenna. And if there was one thing she couldn't stand, it was disloyalty. She huffed out a breath. Her anger with Jenna would pass. Until then, she'd keep to herself, allow the solitude to blanket her. She turned right out of the car park and strode out up the hill, past the small co-op at the mouth of the museum on the gorge. It would be open until 10 o'clock. Perhaps she'd nip in on her way home and buy that bottle of red wine. Sodium lights illuminated the town to spread their warm golden glow as she lengthened her stride and marched along the narrow footpath, puffing out small bursts of vapour as her breath hit the cool evening air. The council had readied the flood barriers for erection along the wharfage as the River Severn continued to rise after an unusually long, wet autumn. It threatened to break its banks early in the season, leaving a dull sense of foreboding for what the rest of the winter would bring. The town wallowed in an eerie quietness. The windows of almost all the premises overlooking the river dark, but for an occasional upstairs light on. Breathless from her overexerted stride, she paused halfway up the hill before crossing the Iron Bridge. A town in the summer overflowing with tourists keen to witness the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the Iron Bridge dominated the landscape with its iron structure pioneered by Abraham Darby in the 18th century. The plethora of museums drew people from all around the world. Somewhere for the locals to avoid. As a tourist town, however, devoid of visitors during the winter months, most of the shops had already closed for the evening. The car park in the little square opposite the Iron Bridge was empty except for a single red car outside the tea emporium as the last of the patrons left for the day. If she'd been earlier, Fliss could have indulged in a fruit scone with jam and cream, accompanied by a cappuccino, or one of their thick, creamy hot chocolates. A treat both she and Jenna often indulged in as they watched the world go by from underneath the fluttering umbrellas outside all year long. Her stomach let out a protesting wail as she turned her back on the cafe. She'd not eaten since lunchtime and couldn't wait to get back to Jenna's. She'd fling together a quick stir-fry in time for Jenna's return. Not that her sister deserved it. The torrid waters of the Severn swirled beneath her as she crossed over the Iron Bridge, deserted since the end of the summer and tourist season, much to her relief. Fliss wasn't in the mood for mad holidaymakers leaping at Domino just because they'd seen 101 Dalmatians and believed they were all cuddly animations instead of big dogs who could give a powerful bite if provoked. Not that Domino would bite anyone. She reached down and scrubbed the top of his head and made his tail go wild. The big softy. With high, prancing steps, Domino's strong muscles bunched and flexed as he matched his pace to hers, happy just to be with her. Snatches of bad temper still curdled in her stomach, and Fliss barely paused as she turned right off the bridge and hit the flat of the wide, disused railway track which led straight to the cooling towers, before unclipping Domino's jaunty red lead. She coiled it around her neck, clipped the end onto one of the metal loops along the lead so it couldn't slide off, and headed after the dog. As he veered off to the left, taking the narrower offshoot from the main path up into the woodland, Fliss automatically followed. She put on a spurt to get her up the first steep incline, blowing out white puffs of breath as the path rose in undulations until she was 30 feet above and parallel to the main drag. Glancing around, Fliss considered her mistake taking that route, as dense vegetation crowded out the light to make it even more difficult to see where she was going. She hesitated and peered down through the dimness at the wider trail. Already twilight, it would soon be an impenetrable black in the woods. With a sniff, Fliss burrowed her nose deeper into her fleece-lined coat against the chill wind whipping through the Ironbridge Gorge, and shrugged. Sure-footed, she was so familiar with the walk, the thought of negotiating it in the dark never bothered her. She wouldn't be too long, and where the paths merged at the base of the cooling towers, she'd return along the wider, safer path. As the peace and quiet of the gorge settled on her, she slowed her pace and breathed deep, allowing the rich, pungent aroma of the undergrowth to encompass her. Sharp scents of wet pine and dark wood smoke rose with snatches of damp soil and musky fungus to invade her senses. Never one to hold on to her temper, she let it go and took in her surroundings. She squinted above her, way up the hillside into the thicket, in the hope she'd spot deer picking their way through. Too dark to make out any shapes, she turned her attention back to the narrow pathway. Thrilled at the fresh crunch of leaves underfoot, she swiped at the piles of them with her boots, like she had when she was a child. Only the thick slide of mud underneath gave her a moment's pause. Perhaps it wasn't wise to kick the protective layer of leaves aside and end up on her backside, or worse still, at the bottom of the steep incline. Jenna would only give her hell. "What were you doing up there at that time of night? How come you slipped? Trust you to get into trouble." Her sister's lecturing voice trailed through Fliss's mind, slowing her down still more. Disappointed, she curled her fingers into the palms of her hands to keep them warm and ambled onward, her eyes straining to catch the quick bursts of Domino as he pounded in mad leaps up and down the hillside, the scent of deer in his nostrils. A wild flash of white shot past her, so close the whip of air stroked her bare hands. The merry jingle of Domino's collar let her know exactly where he was as he tore through again, almost taking her off her feet. Slow down, you balmy dog." God, but she loved him. She laughed out loud as he charged by one more time. It wasn't worth calling him back. He wouldn't take any notice, and it just made her feel stupid when she shouted for a dog that wasn't going to obey. Anyway, he was having fun. She cast a quick glance up at the umbrella of trees and pushed away the regret of coming out here. It was good for him. He needed the exercise, and even in the dark, she was sure-footed. She knew the pathways. Besides, another 20 minutes and she'd be back onto the main track. Although it wasn't lit either, it didn't have the heavy layer of branches canopied over it to draw the night in. It's bloody freezing. She dug icy hands into her pockets and regretted leaving her gloves in the car in her haste and bad temper. She hunched her shoulders up to her ears as the bitter chill seeped bone deep. Mean and sneaky, it found the gaps in the neckline of her coat and filtered through to send ripples of goosebumps over her flesh. Damn. But she should have worn more layers. She kept enough of them in her car. but her temper had got the better of her. She brought her nose out of where she had tucked it in her coat as Domino shot by once more and breathed a sigh of relief that she'd had the sense not to follow the even steeper route up to Patton's Rock. Out of control, Domino flew down the hillside above her, clipped the side of her leg in his headlong rush, and almost sent her over the edge of the path after him. Shit! Her heartbeat spiked as she teetered on the edge, one foot slipping in the mud before she managed to pull herself back. Bloody dog. No sense of personal space. No sense, full stop. She dragged in a deep breath. For her own safety, she slipped her hands back out of her pockets for balance, just in case the dog sideswiped her again and pushed her over the edge. She narrowed her eyes and peered into the blackness of the gorge, while Domino careered through the undergrowth. In her next life, she wanted to be a dog. Wild and carefree, with nothing to worry about. Tough and energetic, just like Domino. Fliss pulled her phone from her pocket and swiped the screen to check the time and then slipped it away again. She'd better get a move on before she couldn't even see the hand in front of her face. Other than the muted sounds of birds settling for the night, the distant echoes of voices and the occasional excited yip from a dog in Dale End Park directly opposite her on the other side of the river, peace settled around her. Head down, she powered on, away from the soft lights of the town, deeper into the murky woodland, accompanied by the comforting thrash of Domino charging around. One foot suddenly shot from underneath her, and she slithered down a short, muddy incline. Arms spread wide, her spine cracked as she jerked upright, and then came to a slippery halt as she grabbed onto the short stretch of wooden hand railing. Still on her feet. Just. Heart beating in the base of her throat, she bent over from the waist and blew out a gusty sigh. Perhaps she shouldn't power on. Perhaps slow and steady was the means to stay alive. Below her, Domino's enthusiasm quietened to soft snuffles, and the darkness closed in. Above her, leaves rustled and twigs snapped. She straightened, held onto her breath to listen. Something else moved amongst the trees. Attuned to the peacefulness of her surroundings, Fliss angled her head so she could hear better. She blinked to focus on the shadowy woodland and waited. If there were deer, she was about to lose her dog if he decided to sprint after them, but the likelihood of deer getting so close wasn't too high, not even the bold muntjac, not with the racket Domino made. She sucked in a lungful of cold air, held it, her brow drawn low as she concentrated. It didn't sound like deer, not unless a whole herd had descended on them. Not a badger either. They would have just thundered past, oblivious of their surroundings. Busy characters, they tended not to stop for anything. This was different, more rhythmic. She tilted her head to one side to better catch the sound. Footsteps. Definitely. Heavy footfall coming straight towards her down the embankment, from the higher pathway leading from Broseley. There was no hesitation in the steps. Some slipping, some sliding, but whoever was there had to be confident of their ability and familiarity with the terrain. "Hello?" Fliss burst out, her voice sharp and demanding, full of confidence she didn't feel. In an instant, the footfall halted. A heavy silence descended from above, but Domino's movement still gave her some reassurance. A big dog, she'd never felt insecure with him around, knowing he'd protect her. Doubt sent small shudders through her as her teeth chattered against the cold. Fliss peered into the darkness above her for movement as she strained to pick up any sound. Nothing. Perhaps it had been deer. Or a badger. Badgers made plenty of noise, but what creature would freeze at the sound of her voice, Most would make off through the undergrowth. As the wind shifted and swirled around her, she picked up the clear sound of the twilight dog-walkers on the other side of the river in Dale End Park. The acoustics of the area carried their voices up the gorge, the long valley emphasizing their muffled laughter and dog barking as though they were right beside her. She turned her head to catch the sound of Domino, quieter now, closer, while he snuffled in the wet autumn leaves, unconcerned by anything other than the scent he'd picked up. She should be reassured by his closeness, but she couldn't dismiss the icy tingle which ran from her neck, down her spine, and kept her still while she scanned the area above her and listened for something. Anything. Nothing. Domino! Fliss hissed out his name as she stepped back to retrace her way along the path. She wasn't yet halfway along, and she considered it may be better to go back, rather than deeper into the woods. Spooked, she focused on the area above her, determined to detect some movement. Her heartbeat throbbed in the base of her throat. She hitched in fast snatches of air as thinly veiled panic skittered through her veins. She tried to regulate her breathing, held it for a long moment, while she listened for further sounds, concerned more at the unsettling silence above her. She turned her head at the crackle of leaves as Domino moved closer. Good boy. Come on, Domino. Good boy. With a hushed croon, she bent from the hips and kept her face upturned to watch for any movement, her head tilted to listen. She groped for the dog's harness, soothing him while she stroked one hand along his smooth, warm body and took what comfort she could from his presence. With her free hand, she reached into her pocket for her mobile phone. Despite Domino's closeness, her icy fingers still fumbled while she clenched her jaw and pushed back the flutter of fear. Clouds skimmed over the full moon to blot out the light. The damned dark, always the subject of her nightmares. She swiveled on her heel, released the dog's harness, and swiped at the quick dial for her sister's number as she strode back the way she'd come as quickly as the narrow path would allow. As though he sensed her discomfort, Domino matched his pace to hers and trotted along 2 steps ahead. The phone gave a sharp trill at the other end. The fierce glow from the light heightened the density of the surrounding darkness as it closed in around her. Determined to tamp down on the panic, Fliss snapped her spine ramrod straight as she edged her way back along the path and waited for her sister to pick up. Just the sound of Jenna's voice would give her confidence, although she was never going to admit to being frightened. The signal slipped down to 2 bars, and then dropped out. From the sinister quiet above her, the dry crack of a twig broke through her thoughts, and Fliss sobbed out a desperate gasp while she froze in her tracks to stare into the cloying blackness. There was someone there, someone above her, watching. Hello? Is anyone there? Disgusted at the quaver in her own voice, Fliss held her breath and listened. Silence. Domino circled around and came to stand by her side, and she reached out, touched his shoulder, seeking reassurance from his presence. His head came up, and he scented the air. She swiped Jenna's number again and prayed for the signal to kick back in. Domino's low growl vibrated through Fliss's hand where she rested it. The short hair of his hackles rose under her fingers, and he stood solid beside her. Every muscle in his body quivered to attention. Heart knocking hard against her chest, Fliss inched the phone away from her ear to give her a better chance to listen to any further movement above. The phone pealed out its first ring and pierced the quiet. The glow from it blinded her to her surroundings. Damn it, Jenna, pick up! Pick up! Fliss just needed to hear her sister's voice, stabilise herself once more. That's what Jenna did for her, She steadied her in her darkest moments. She'd ground her, make her see the unreasonableness of her worries without making her seem like a fool. The connection failed again, and Fliss stabbed a shaky finger at the screen. Damn it! Connect! She drew a shuddering breath in through her nose and tried to still the rising fear. As she debated whether to run or stand and face the dark presence, Domino's warning growl turned to a deep, vicious snarl, and terror froze Fliss to the spot. Chapter 2. Friday the 26th of October, 16:20 hours. Light from her phone bathed her pretty face in a soft golden glow while she stared right at him. Clouds skimmed over the bright white moon, then off again to leave a shimmer of silvery light casting through the shadowed woodland. The man watched, raking his fingertips over the whiskers on his chin to make them rasp. There was nothing for it. She'd left him with no choice. "Stupid bitch," he murmured under his breath. It wasn't his fault. She'd provoked him. She should have gone on her way without looking at him. What the hell was she doing there, anyhow? Why couldn't she have minded her own business, instead of poking her nose up in the air to watch his every move? If just she'd walked away and let him get on with what he'd come to sort out, she'd have been safe. But now he had to deal with her and that fucking dog. He hated dogs. Unpredictable bastards. His mother had had one when he was a boy. Some sort of fucking terrier. The worst. Whenever he'd come into the room, it had always growled. His mother had thought it funny, thought it was being protective. But the protectiveness stopped when he shoved a knife through its throat and buried it in a shallow grave in the back garden, along with the neighbour's cat. Animals. Nasty little bastards. They should all be destroyed. He bent down, picked up a solid branch as thick as the top of his arm, and weighed it in his hands. Without a clear view of the dog, he had no idea what breed it was, but from the amount of thrashing around, it sounded like a monster. No fucking little terrier. He altered his grip on the branch. Whatever the breed, it wouldn't stand much of a chance against him if he caught it right. He may not be armed with a knife this time, but his weapon of necessity was a good one. He smiled as the woman stared at her phone. He couldn't hear her words, but her mouth worked frantically as he imagined she cursed at the lack of signal in the area. There was never a signal in the gorge, not a sustainable one at any rate. Panic-filled eyes blinked up at him as she took her attention off the phone to scan the tree line where he stood. Stupid bitch couldn't take her gaze from him. He drew in a calming breath. If only she hadn't stared, she'd be safe. It was her own fault, not his. He gave the bow another measure in his hands, forced himself to listen to his calming inner voice. It's okay. It's just a little diversion to your plans. Keep calm. You can deal with this. His gaze never left the woman below. The wind whipped through the gorge, and he hunched his shoulders against the chill. She turned to leave, stepped into the finger of shadow below. He couldn't let her go. She'd seen him. She'd know who he was. She'd be able to identify him. Mind made up, he waited for movement below to estimate where the dog was, and then he gathered his strength and launched himself towards the light from the phone, pulling his lips back from his teeth in a soundless scream. As prepared as he was for it, 38 kilograms of pure muscle took him by surprise as the dog released a ferocious growl and leapt up to meet him. A snarling mass of white, The man knew in an instant he'd underestimated his foe. Terror streaked through him. He swung hard, gripped the solid branch with both hands, and let instinct rule. The quick whip of adrenaline raced wild and free through his veins, instilling him with the strength he needed to accomplish the task. His shoulder jarred on impact and punched a sick jolt of pain through him, but satisfaction overrode the ball of nausea spinning through his stomach. The branch he held splintered in two, accompanied by a crack loud enough to be the dog's neck breaking. He hoped. Whether it did or not, the animal hit the floor like a sack of wet cement and flipped off the path, down the steep hillside. The body smashed through the undergrowth, cracking twigs and branches. The woman's shrill scream chased it all the way as she shrieked the dog's name. Domino! A sense of achievement that he'd bested the creature rolled off him as the man squared up to meet the lesser of his enemies. The crackle and groan of his shoulder didn't bother him, as adrenaline sent a power surge through his system to disguise the pain. Wild laughter bubbled inside, and he grinned. Easy pickings. A weak, pathetic woman. He was strong and dangerous. Empowered by his success, he flung the remains of his branch to one side and stepped closer to the woman. His bare hands would be enough to deal with her. Shock filled her eyes, huge and shadowed in a pale face, illuminated by the light of her phone and the glimmer of moonlight edging through the trees. She gave a slow blink, and he grinned. Her bad luck she'd frozen instead of run. Silly little slag. A wicked thrill pulsed through him to fill him with vitality. Surprise quickened the adrenaline spiking his energy levels. It felt good. This power he'd discovered. His blood singing through his veins, he glared at her, punched his arm out to grab her as she stepped back. Her feet slipped in the thick, sticky mud. Surprised, he grappled with the sleeve of her coat, desperate to hold on to her as, with a sudden burst of unexpected energy, she flung her arms up. The hold he had on her loosened, and, in desperation, she shook off his fingers and wrenched away. Her shrill scream pierced his ears as she teetered on the edge of the path. He snatched at her one last time before she crashed down the gorge, the same way as her dog, ear-splitting screams echoing around the valley. Panic chased away his excitement, and shock gathered in his gut as the fast smackdown of adrenaline left him with the shakes. He dipped his head to follow the sound of her descent above the frenzied crash of his heart. Stupid! Stupid! He smacked the heel of his hand against his temple. They'll all hear, the fuckers. Those walking their dogs on the other side of the river. Nosy, interfering bastards. She'd ruined everything. Damn her. The bitch. The echo of his furious internal scream reverberated through his mind. Dizzy with rage, he started his descent, pounding downhill, slithering sideways through the thick undergrowth that snagged at his boots and threatened to upend him. But he had no choice. Help would come, and he only had a short time to sort out the matter he'd come to deal with. At the sudden rise of voices, he glared across the river, anger pushing back the panic. Those bloody dog walkers would send help. They'd phone the police in response to the stupid woman's blood-curdling screams. Interfering fuckers, always reporting the locals for any indiscretions. Bloody dog-walking neighbourhood watch. A frustrated grunt stuck in his throat. She'd seen him. She'd be able to identify him. If she was still alive, he'd kill her. Anger writhed in the pit of his stomach. If he had more time, he'd make her suffer, break her fingers one at a time, twist her arms until she cried out in her pain, yank her hair from her head, stab his cigarette butts deep into her soft flesh. In his fury, He ground his teeth until his jaw popped, and then he skidded down the steep side of the hill, his feet skating through the perilous vegetation, barely getting purchase as he broke into a run, unable to put the brakes on. He whipped the small torch from his back pocket and turned it on to scan the area. He shielded the arc of light with one hand, so it only glowed onto the ground. He didn't have time for this shit. He'd deal with her, but it would have to be quick and efficient. Chapter 3. Friday the 26th of October, 16:30 hours. She slithered to a stop, choking on her own desperate gasps as horror clawed at her chest. Her world ricocheted in violent revolutions. Pain lanced through her knee from ramming into the brickwork of the ancient Severn Valley Railway Bridge. Partially buried beneath the hillside, the thick slide of black mud filled its belly from the entrance at the top of the short tunnel to spew it out of the mouth at the bottom where it converged with the wider pathway. Breathless, she barely paused before she whipped over onto her knees, ignoring the deep burn where the undergrowth had ripped her flesh. She scrambled around, patting the ground. She ignored the streaks of pain spearing the palms of her hands as the warm scent of blood filled her nostrils and a metallic taste coated her tongue. Domino! Desperate, she whispered his name under her breath as she reached out for him. Her head still spun, while crazy white lights slashed across her vision. Frantic, she swiped a hand along the brick edge of the partially submerged railway tunnel to center herself, to picture where she'd landed and visualize an escape route. She raised her head, spared the slope a cursory glance. There was a lunatic up there, but if she could grab Domino and make a run for it along the wide track, she'd hopefully reach the safety of the iron bridge. She groped around, grasped at leaves and branches in a desperate bid to locate Domino. Domino! She hissed through clenched teeth. He had to be there somewhere. With trembling hands, she sought any heat source to hint at his presence. She'd plummeted down the hill right behind him, head over heels in wild rotations, enough to knock the stuffing out of her. She should have landed on top of him, but she could easily have tumbled in a different direction. A desperate sob tore free of her tight throat. Where was he? He had to be near. She needed him, needed to know he was safe. Her voice croaked out as she called for him again. Domino! Oh God, Domino! Where are you? In the pitch dark, she focused, desperate to catch a glimpse of his bright white fur, but the moon was not on her side and hid its glow behind another rush of clouds. A thrashing movement from above alerted her. She reared her head back and squinted up at the lighter skyline as the clouds parted and she caught a glimpse of the dark outline of the maniac as he moved on the pathway above. Her breath caught in her throat as he started his descent. He came towards her in a mad rush. Panic clenched her stomach in a tight fist as she scrambled deeper under the recess of the tunnel, following the upward slope of it into the darkness. The pain of her damaged knee radiated through her leg. If she tried to run, he'd see her. Her only hope was to stay where she was. Hide. She slapped one hand over her mouth to staunch the flow of wild sobs from bursting out, stop her breath from wheezing. She reached out. Just a touch of reassurance he was there was all she needed. Alive. The man would go. She'd get Domino to the vets. It would be all right. She fumbled around, grasped something solid. Cold. Waxy. Bright white lights danced across her vision. Partially buried beneath a thick carpet of wet leaves, branches and twigs, Fliss moulded her fingers across the unmistakable contours of a person's face. Her fingers trembled as she skimmed them over the nose, traced the outline of the lips and curve of the chin, down the neck. She smoothed her hands over stone-cold shoulders, and down until she encountered the obvious definition of a pair of breasts. The sick slide of horror turned her stomach to a churning ball of grease. She swallowed the nausea, but it still rose up her throat until she gagged. Unlike her sister, she'd never encountered a dead person before, but there was no doubt the waxen iciness she had her hand on was human flesh. She snatched her hand back as a scream lodged in her throat. Fueled by terror, her mind wiped clear of everything but the desperate desire to escape. Haste made her clumsy as she scrambled to her feet and turned back the way she had come, her priority no longer to hide, but to run, to escape. The black shadow of a man stopped her dead in her tracks as he filled the entrance to the tunnel, flicked on a bright white flashlight to blind her, and reached for her. He picked out the pale glow of her face in the light of his torch and traced the arc of it down her body as she crouched in front of him at the mouth of the tunnel, her knees sunk deep into the mud. The stupid woman had her dog's lead circled around her neck. Convenient for him, deadly for her. As she stumbled to her feet, the squelch of mud dragging her back down, her eyes glazed in the bright gleam of his torch. Fury, dark and dangerous, snapped through him. She'd ruined everything. It was her fault. She'd left him with no option. Surprise leapt in his throat as she surged forward, took the first steps to run, but his adrenaline was still high and the savage animal inside surfaced. He grasped the red lead with his fingers and yanked hard until she slammed face first into his chest. The thrill of power coursing back through his veins made him stronger, fiercer. He wrenched the lead, twisted it around his hand 1, 2, 3 times, and grinned as she dropped to her knees in front of him, just where the little slapper should be. Surprise widened her eyes as they bulged, threatened to pop out of her head. He grinned with savage satisfaction as her pitiful snatches of breath gurgled through her throat and sent a stream of wild delirium rushing through him. The crack of her bones gave him strength as he wrangled the lead, wrapped it tighter around his hands with a solid, firm pressure while he allowed his fury to command him. He'd wanted to savour the moment, but she deprived him with her stupid, pathetic screams. She'd not have another chance now he had her under his power. Pleasure spiked, while her hoarse gasps became weaker as he held on until the give in her body slumped her forward, a dead weight in his hands. Only to be expected. He'd broken her neck, felt the crack of it beneath his fingers. Stupid cow, with her useless ideas. Just like his wife. Why wrap a lead around your neck? It was an invitation to be choked. He gave one last vicious twist. Limp and lifeless, she left him with nothing but disgust at such an easy kill. At least his wife had given him years of satisfaction. She'd been strong and resilient, a scrapper. He sneered at the woman. This tragic excuse hadn't even put up a fight. Untangling his fingers from the lead, he released her and allowed her body to slump forward over his feet, giving her a disgusted nudge with his boot. Silly bitch, she'd ruined his evening, then robbed him of the time he would have enjoyed making her suffer by letting out those god-awful screams which had echoed across the valley. Straining to hear, he tilted his head to one side and listened to the familiar sounds of voices from across the river, pitched low with concern. With the weight of the woman on his feet, he glanced down, and pride edged its way through his annoyance. He'd killed her. He'd reflect on the horror in her expression later, give himself some satisfaction. For a brief moment, he allowed himself a self-satisfied smile to gloat over his conquest, and then drew in gulp after gulp of fresh air, holding each one as control slid back into place. He needed to move. Get out of there before the police turned up. It would take them an age to reach him, unless there was already someone deployed this side of the river. Unlikely, but possible. The muted ring of a phone filtered through to his conscience. His heart rate, almost back to normal, spiked up again while he scanned the area for the source of the sound. He kicked the weight of the body off his feet and circled around, his narrowed gaze focused on the ground. He traced his small flashlight over the area, scanning inside the tunnel where his dead wife lay, white and waxen under the partial protection of leaves. His lip curled with disgust. He'd no time now to do more to cover her, nor look for a fucking ringing phone that must have landed screen down so the light wasn't visible. It didn't matter. He didn't need a dead woman's phone. If just it would stop fucking ringing. Flicking off the flashlight so it didn't attract attention, the man turned, his feet skidding in the mulch of leaves as he leapt over the other woman's body onto the old railway path below. He wiped his hands on his combat trousers while he considered his next move. He could drag her up into the tunnel too, place her next to his wife. Aware the insistent peal of the telephone had stopped, he peered into the darkness across the river. He couldn't risk any more time. He needed to get out of there. As a familiar voice emerged from the undergrowth, every muscle in his body froze. "Hello, this is Detective Sergeant Jenna Morgan. I'm sorry I'm not available to take your call, but please leave a message and I'll get back to you." Fuck it. A long beep sounded in the darkness as he whipped his head around to stare at the crumbled form behind him. The rush of wild water spun through his head, making it real. Stupid cow. What the hell was she doing here? He gave the body a vicious kick. The soft sigh of a moan floated up to him, and his pulse rate shot up. He listened for another sound, but there was nothing. He'd killed her. She was dead. She had to be. Perhaps it was just his imagination. He leaned in, pushed the lead out of the way, and placed 2 fingers against the side of her neck. The thready flutter of a pulse danced beneath his fingertips. She was still alive. Fuck. With a quick glance over the river, he made a decision as he squatted next to her body. If he hurried, he could take her. Fate had possibly dealt him a good hand for a change. He could take her home. Keep her. He stared into the recess of the tunnel, focused hard, but couldn't quite make out the naked body of his wife. He chewed his lip as he pushed the fine hair back from his forehead. She'd be a replacement for Mary. Chapter 4. Friday the 26th of October, 16:35 hours. Detective Sergeant Jenna Morgan jiggled the car keys in her hand as she caught the attention of Detective Constable Mason Ellis. Her partner of choice loitered at the public service counter. She gave a quick jerk of her head to persuade him to follow her out of the main doors of Malinsgate, Telford's main police station. As he caught up with her, she kept her voice low while they passed a group of vociferous teenagers bouncing with overexcited enthusiasm as they crossed the concrete moat that led to the station car park. "We've had a report of a woman's screams heard in Benthor Edge Wood. Dog handler was already in the area, so he's picking it up. I think it's Sergeant Bennett." Down to earth and old school, Jenna had confidence that he'd investigate anything amiss with cool efficiency. "We've been asked to meet him at Ironbridge car park, south of the river, and check it out while uniform take north of the river at Dale End car park. Apparently, the Twilight dog walkers called it in. They're a bit panicked by all accounts." "Are they the lot you sometimes meet with the daft Dally?" "You know he's not daft, he's—" She struggled to find the word to describe her sister's gorgeous, dynamic Dalmatian. Ebullient.
Ebullient, huh? He ate your kitchen.
Stirred to defend him, Jenna struggled to be generous. Not the entire kitchen, only the doors.
Yeah.
With a long, drawn-out groan, Mason stretched his body, arms above his head, as he walked side by side with Jenna towards the squad car. Jenna glanced up at him as he yawned until his jaw cracked. She flashed him a smile. Sorry, pal. We nearly made it to the end of the day without going into overtime. 5 more minutes and we would have been home and free. She should never have answered the bloody call. She should have let one of the other teams catch it. Now they'd be tied up for at least an hour on some stupid kids yowling in the woods. Little buggers should be home by now, playing on their iPads or glued to some reality TV program. It was the full moon with Halloween around the corner. Jenna glanced at her watch and winced. Weariness had seeped through to her bones so deep she just wanted to go home. Her feet ached like a bitch. With brand new boots, she hadn't envisaged leaving the station. It was supposed to have been a meeting and paperwork day. A boot breaking in day.
Do you want me to drive?
Mason gave her a lazy smile, a cocky quirk to his lips, which meant he thought he knew the answer before she spoke. Yeah, actually. She gained a small nugget of satisfaction as he twisted his head to a better angle to peer into her face, and, she imagined, to judge whether she was taking the piss. She jerked a casual shrug. I've some messages to pick up. Greg kept us tied up in some political meeting today. I lost interest after the first 3 minutes. I think it was to do with paper wastage. She slid into the passenger seat as Mason plugged in his seatbelt and fired up the black police-issue Vauxhall insignia.
Toilet or printer?
She snorted as she picked up the radio. Printer, but it sounded like shit to me. She pressed the speak button. Juliet Alpha 76 to control, over. Juliet Alpha 76, go ahead. We're called to attend on the south side of the river at Benthall Edge. As we're on the north side, it would be quicker if we question the informants at Dale End Park, as you already have the dog handler deployed on the south. Clicking the button off, Jenna held on and prayed for the lesser deployment as she listened to static for a moment before the reply came through. Affirmative. Thank you, Lord. Jenna grinned as she slipped the radio back into its casing. I really didn't want to get my new boots muddy walking along the gorge. She flexed her feet in her boots and regretted yanking them on that morning. Geez, it's probably only some teenagers scaring themselves witless over there. Halloween comes earlier every year. She huffed out a sigh. Taking her mobile phone out of her pocket, she dialed into her answer phone, while Mason pushed to the speed limit along the Queensway dual carriageway. The first 2 messages were people chasing for follow-ups. The third was 2 minutes of static from her sister, fully furnished with background noise. She'd probably pocket-dialed her by mistake. God only knows what the heavy breathing was about. It better not be her sister having sex. Chance would be a fine thing if Fliss found a new man to put a zing in her life, but Jenna really didn't need to hear it. She tapped her finger on the screen and deleted the call as Mason took the turn off down Cherry Tree Hill and hit the speed bumps with a little more force than necessary. She grunted as she shot him a sideways look. This is why I don't let you drive, Mason. She caught his wild grin and shook her head as she turned back to her phone. The fourth call was her inspector demanding to know why she hadn't got back to caller 1, who happened to be a local councillor. With a heavy sigh, Jenna hit delete on that, as she'd already winged the local councillor problem to one of her DCs, asking them to report back to her. She tucked her phone in her pocket as Mason drew their police unit into Dale End car park. She stepped out of the car, and the cold bite of air had her sucking in her breath. It was downhill from now on. She hated winter. Fliss loved to curl up in front of a roaring fire with a glass of whiskey and a good book. Jenna would far rather live abroad for 6 months of the year, somewhere warm, bordering on hot. As they approached the group of familiar people and dogs milling around, Jenna puffed out a sigh of relief as one of the old-school uniforms, notebook in hand, questioned a lady with a small black Labrador slumped at her feet. Molly. The dog was called Molly. Jenna hadn't a clue what the owner's name was, but they often saw each other when she and Fliss walked Domino. Jenna had come to know the dog walkers, a sociable crowd, always willing to let in another dog walker, imparting their knowledge and experience. She knew so little of their personal lives, but everything about their dogs. Little Molly who'd had 2 litters of puppies. Jenna had been tempted to have one herself, and then Domino had eaten her damned kitchen and put paid to her aspirations to own a dog. Jenna scanned the others in the group. Hope, the black and white terrier, stood with her dad, a tall, innocuous older gentleman with a shock of white hair. Ollie, the golden retriever, still bounded around, no amount of calmness influencing his mad dash, while his owner, a short, blonde-haired woman, chewed the side of her nail as she stood on the outskirts of the small crowd, her nervous energy pulsing off her. Jenna recognised Henry, a retired police constable, with his 3 spaniels obediently at heel, faces turned to look up at him, full of anticipation as they awaited his next command. He stood apart from the crowd, solid, reassuring, and when she caught his gaze, gave her a calm wink. He'd wait his turn, knowing they'd get to him. Another couple hovered, their hands linked together while Punch, the mottled staffy, panted heavily, mouth wide open in a mawing grin. A desperate relief washed over Molly's owner's features as Jenna approached.
Hey, Domino's auntie.
The woman stepped forward, her fingers clenched together. Jenna smiled in an attempt to ease the woman's anxiety. It wasn't something she'd noticed before. Molly's mum always exuded a calm assurance, happy to dole out words of wisdom on just about any subject. Molly's mum? She touched the woman's arm in reassurance. Scratching Molly behind the ears, Jenna scanned the group and then turned her attention to the uniform, PC Ted Walker, one of the longest-serving police officers in Malinsgate. Loved his job and never wanted to retire. A damned good, solid PC. She dropped her voice so her familiarity with the experienced PC only carried to his ears. "What you got, Ted?" Flicking back the pages of his notebook, PC Walker squinted in the dull orange glow from the streetlight.
"Several accounts. They all seem to be in agreement. The collective claimed to have heard a woman's voice shouting a name south of the river."
He stretched his arm full length, his hand, spade-like, turned sideways as though he was directing traffic.
"Directly opposite this point."
Jenna gazed at the bank on the opposite side of the river. If it had been full light, it was close enough to wave to people on the opposite side, or holler to them, as often happened. The lower pathway, a disused railway line, having long been taken up to leave a wide, flat track.